This is a book launch. I didn't have a launch for my last two books, Selling Hitler, Propaganda and the Nazi Brand, and the other one, Marketing the Third Reich, Persuasion, Packaging and Propaganda. I felt that both the theme and the cover were too tasteless and vulgar to have a book launch. It just made one feel a little nervous that people would think one's addiction to that subject matter arose out of impure political thoughts. Nevertheless, although Paul's anecdote about the stamps was quite amusing, the strangest event among the Nazis was in the making of the film The Great Love, starring the Swedish singer Zara Leander, who is a very tall lady with broad shoulders. In order to get the right theatrical effect, they had to dress the entire regiment, the Lebensstandard Adolf Hitler, Hitler's personal regiment, in sequin dresses, standing behind her, mounted up on the steps, because only these men were as tall as her. You can tell that they're not women because they have Adam's apples, but they represented the finest of the military elite of Nazi Germany in tight, clingy, sequined dresses. It's an absolutely extraordinary thing to look at, especially with a magnifying glass. But the approach, really, I think we take is founded on the notion that propaganda is the core dynamic of human history, or rather, more specifically, persuasion. In other words, if we look at the structures of society, we ask, how did they get there? They didn't evolve organically. They were put there at some stage by some process of evolution. And the fuel of that evolution was propaganda. Votes for women, the fight against slavery, all of these things were vast propaganda escapades in their day. This social structure was created by propaganda. It is, as I say, the core dynamic of human history, right back to the Assyrians, right back to the Greeks. Aristotle in his Rhetoric was the first to theorize about propaganda. And of course, especially the Romans. Everything from Trajan's column to the Parnes et Circuses, the great games of the Roman state and so forth. These were all extraordinary propaganda exercises, and they laid the foundations for what was to come. And it's no accident, of course, that both Napoleon and Hitler adopted a lot of the symbolism of Caesarian propaganda. But propaganda it was, and the core understanding was the importance of entertainment, something which we haven't really spoken about so far, and yet the entertaining side of propaganda is based on the insight that most people are bored by politics. So we elect clowns. Trump, an extraordinary master of this confected illusion with the terrible, simple slogan, "Make America Great Again." However did we arrive at this condition? Well, we've been at this condition throughout human history. The great Roman symbol of the double-headed axe with the sticks of wood, the slogan, "Senatus Populus Quae Romanus," all of these things were part of the brand management. The fact is that Rome was not run by the Senate and people after Caesar and Augustus. It was run by the emperor of the next, 500 years. But nevertheless, the myth continued, and it was a propaganda myth. So we can go right down the centuries to the Norman conquest, the bio-tapestry, right through the medieval world, the propaganda of Richard II, for example, the Wilton vintage, and so on, right through the Reformation, Luther, the English Civil War, the American Revolution, the French Revolution. You find this gathering momentum. How very strange, therefore, that the word propaganda dropped out of use, because words are conceptual tools. If we lack a word for something, we don't see it. And the word propaganda atrophied, it went out of use, even though its significance continued and continued. It literally, I think if we look at the 20th century, we see the toxic effect of what actually happened. It's an extraordinary thing. but we have to study its precise dynamics at that time. You have, of course, the First World War, and all films like The Kaiser, Beast of Berlin, and all the other tricks we did, like dropping menus from London restaurants and hotels on a starving Berlin and so forth, leading to the diagnosis by all Germans that they had lost the war through the necromancy, the superior magic of the British, because they couldn't possibly have lost it by military means, not to the British, to a German, a nationalist. That was simply non-credible. There had to be some alternative hypothesis, and that hypothesis was propaganda. And after this time, propaganda became, and the belief in propaganda became, the common currency of all Germans, of the German Communist Party, the German Socialists, the SDP, and so forth. All of them, not just Goebbels, mounted the most extraordinary propaganda campaigns. And this evolved, of course, into the election of Hitler and the Third Reich, as we know. But if you look at the precise mechanisms, the actual things they did, they are extraordinary. The Nazis, for example, were losing the game in 1932. They lost by the end of the year 2 million votes. The German bourgeois were terrified of the Nazi support for the German transport workers' strike. What they then did, and this was the trigger to get them into a coalition government with Hindenburg, headed initially by von Papen with Hindenburg's express consent, was a small election in a minor state called Lippe, right at the end of 32, which they flooded with propaganda resources. They won that particular state after losing for months, and it was that mechanism which first put them into power. But in the 30s, if you imagine what they actually did to be a cascade of racist horror and so forth, the truth is much more complex. They could be both subtle and crude. For example, in the run-up to power, in the years from 1921 to 1933, there are only 4 anti-Semitic Nazi posters out of about 125 extant. If you ask what were the anti-Semitic films they made through the 1930s, there were none. They used a Swedish film, in fact, Peterson and Blendl. So what you see there is the most extraordinary manipulation of public consciousness, which actually evolved into something global once they'd built the 8 massive transmitters at Ziesen for the 1936 Olympic Games. After that time, they could hit the world. They even had a Radio Waziristan to hit the northwest frontier of India. They had a Radio Cymru, a Radio Caledonia, a Christian People's Station, a Workers' Challenge Station. They're absolutely extraordinary, this torrent of saturation propaganda which hit the airwaves. And of course, they recruited the president of the Indian National Congress, Subhas Chandra Bose. So that was really, I suppose, a warning about our own time, and it did immense damage. It neutralized the countries which were not sure which side to go for. It had an extraordinary impact, though not really the one they wanted, on British public opinion, where 70% of radio listeners at weekends were listening to Lord Hall, 70% of them. And they were fascinated. I mean, the BBC just gave you 6 hours of an organist called Sandy McPherson. But Lord Hall was Mephistophelian. He was dark. He had this honeyed voice. And the critique he gave of British culture and political society was so caustic that some have speculated it was, in fact, the proximate cause for the organizing of the Beveridge Report, which laid the foundation for the NHS and the welfare state, because of his critique transmitted over the airwaves constantly. So what we have is perhaps the background for our own era. After the war, of course, we became desensitized to the concept of propaganda and replaced it with more neutral terms like information, like communication. And indeed, in the Cold War, the communist propaganda seemed to have entered a kind of stylistic rut especially after the Zhdanov decrees of 1947. We had propaganda wars, we had propaganda battles, but they seemed peripheral, even if the Soviets were quite capable of claiming that AIDS was created by the CIA and so forth. They would typically use an article in an Indian newspaper in order to inject that into the bloodstream. But these rumors really never got very far. And although there are some interesting things which presage our own era, like Radio Free Algiers, this was the time when Arab fighters were popular in the West. They actually held a big exhibition in New York City to which these are the Algerian Liberation Front, Senator Kennedy, Senator Jack Kennedy went, and the Radio Free Algiers was regarded as a great and powerful voice against the imperialism of the French. So these things evolved, they developed, but essentially throughout the later 20th century, the word propaganda disappeared because we felt we were in the broad sunlit uplands of a more rational era. We felt that we were no longer Hobbesian man. We felt we were no longer a mass of craven emotions and visceral desires, but actually had reached a more ideal phase, dreamt of for years, even centuries, by philosophers, when discourse was rational, the preserve of experts. People were making calculated, evidence-based decisions, based also on a shared humanity and all those things. And so you see, this kind of craven world of propaganda we describe as having a kind of dead hand over all of human history, although one can exaggerate. It did some great things too, the great war for votes for women, or the eternal battle against slavery. All of these things show the benign side of propaganda, that it can be, and often has been, a force for human enlightenment. Nevertheless, if we look at the dark stain in human history, which is the 20th century, there are many questions which were left answering. It's not only propaganda's role in the Third Reich, which was quite unique in that it was not just an instrument of governing, but a medium of government. There was an entire division of the Wehrmacht devoted to propaganda. Everything was contested and argued about for its propaganda meaning and significance. Even women's hairdos were an important factor in the Third Reich. When economics-minded ministers wanted to abolish the permanent wave, in 1944, Hitler personally intervened so that German women could still have the permanent wave at hair salons in Nazi Germany. It was extraordinary, but we should never forget Russia. Radio Moscow had a global presence from the 1920s. The films of Eisenstein are still regarded as great classics, and the early propaganda of the Bolsheviks, the posters they hung, are incredibly valuable today. The Bolsheviks taught the world with their propaganda trains, one of which is represented here in London in the Museum of the Moving Image. What the Bolsheviks did was really christen the concept and give it a new relevance, and the Nazis merely seized the baton. But as I say, by the later 20th century, when we had the very first beginnings of the internet, we felt that we really arrived, that we could permit a kind of anarchy of the internet, and this was the great new thing, simply because we were more rational and mature human beings. How wrong we were. The actual potential of the internet was really first realized actually by Al-Qaeda, and Paul describes these, should we say, rather morose, actually I found them wildly exciting, sessions we had watching Al-Qaeda movies, and we became experienced media critics of terrorist propaganda. The one I think we both loved most was that great film, The Will of the Martyr Hafiz Usman. It is no joke. Some of these were immensely simple and crude. Some were actually rather magical. It seems a terrible thing to say, but they really were excellent. at manipulating human emotion. It was extraordinary to see these people talk emotionally and so forth, recordings of battles, all these things. And finally, they graduated, of course, to computer-generated imagery. It's that which I think frightened us most when we saw the film The Wills of the Knights of the London Raid, with its computer-generated underground trains coming into King's Cross and so forth and then blowing up. That really struck home as perhaps nothing did. But we cottoned on to this feeling that something extraordinarily profound was happening in the world, the global consciousness. But those Al-Qaeda films were still made by a hierarchical and cognitive elite. We were still in the age of didactic propaganda. What had not happened then has happened now. This is the extraordinary thing, but for the first time, we have the democratization of propaganda. That is really the new development. Throughout all of human history, you have powerful elites or oppositional cognitive groups and so forth doing propaganda, but it needs resources, it needs organizing. Today, a kid in a bedroom, a student in a bedroom, can become a globally famous propagandist. Last year, the city of Birmingham virtually stopped moving because a 21-year-old American had arrived in town, and this guy, what he specializes in is makeup tutorials. He smothers his face with makeup. I've never seen them, but apparently he's very brilliant at his task. But he has a massive global following of millions. And so the whole city of Birmingham came to a standstill, and the authorities were dumbstruck because all his acolytes had turned up to watch him. This is where we are now, and what the book actually does is really focus on the last 5 years. 15 years ago, I published a book, Politics and Propaganda, Weapons of Mass Seduction. You couldn't do that now, and the book seems a stunning anachronism. No one now could write a book on propaganda. This one, which tries to cover a lot of the subject, not all of it, is actually 34 chapters. What has happened over the past 5 years is almost beyond belief, and it's intimately related to the rise of the whole notion of co-production, the internet and echo chamber, and specifically the empowering of individuals, both to reply, to respond, but also to make their own. One early example was the 2008 US presidential election, where an American soldier, an ordinary American soldier, made a YouTube video critiquing Obama. It was respectful, but very, very articulate and effective. Almost overnight, that soldier had got 11 million hits. 11 million people had watched it. Not since Thersites, the common soldier, challenged the great warrior Achilles 3,000 years ago at the siege of Troy, had an ordinary soldier got so much visibility. This was surely a harbinger of what was to come in this extraordinary era of the way we live now. And so since that time, we've seen the rise of ISIS. But ISIS worked through open source. In other words, it didn't have any vetting at all of its propagandists. You just fed into the ISIS Twitter stream like thousands of others. So it was a hydra-headed monster. You could never stop it because its acolytes throughout the world were contributing. They were making more and more ISIS propaganda. There was no central control, even though, of course, there were central artifacts like the magazine Dabiq. The fact is that ultimately ISIS had an open source approach. So you have this almost steroidal growth in propaganda, which is, as I say, something which, as Paul rightly suggested, people do not have the tools at the moment to really properly negotiate. It's not just the whole story of ISIS. And don't forget that the capture of Mosul 5 years ago was the greatest victory in all of human history, because 500 ISIS soldiers put to flight 30,000 soldiers of the Iraqi army, 30,000 vanquished by 500. Mosul was conquered by ISIS. Now, I cannot think of anything in human history remotely like it. Perhaps there is. We know the 300 Spartans, all of that. Maybe that's more impressive. But why did 500 vanquish 3,000 and put them to flight? Fear is the answer. But fear conveyed through propaganda, fear incubated, fear organized through propaganda. It is the most extraordinary story. And finally, of course, the tale ends really with counter-propaganda. My friend, or the nephew of an old friend, Jamie Monckton, described to me how he had, when in the SAS, agents in Mosul and Raqqa, how they recruited these agents through clandestine radio stations, and how the agents would photograph ISIS positions, map them onto Google Maps, then they'd send in an airstrike. Well, that's extraordinary, and not surprisingly, Jamie now works for a PR company. And so war has become a branch of the advertising industry, and it has become so stressed that if you serve in the SAS, ultimate machismo calling, what you do afterwards is become a PR executive. That says everything you need to know about the way we live now, and this world which has exploded before our eyes, with Trump and Twitter and so forth. You think of Trump in his silk robe at 3 o'clock in the morning, wandering the corridors of the White House, anointing his Twitter feed. I mean, this gross man, this grotesque individual, this comic goon, this clown, has become the most powerful man in the world and may well win election. You talk about his sexual philandering. I mean, my God, in Florida over Christmas, 2 grand ladies, American of mature years, described being sexually inappropriately touched by Trump. They said, you know, this was years ago, but they said, well, he creeps up behind you at parties, you're there with your husband, he creeps up behind you and he touches your shoulder behind like that. And you turn round and there is the Donald in all his ghastly idiocy. So that this man could win, partly the Parnes et circuses of Rome, that the people are turned on by entertainment and turned off by policy. But there's something more than that happening. For a man in his 70s, it's almost unbelievable that he managed to master a particular kind of social media in the way he did, such that actually it is a stream of consciousness into which the 60 million or so followers in the world can tap into any time and understand the brain of the President of the United States. I know that Spitting Image in the 80s had a skit under Reagan, the president's brain is missing. But today you can actually penetrate that brain and see inside all the clicking and the working and the stuff spewing out of it as it's made. So what we've got then, the Russian troll farms, the bots, the fake news, the misinformation, the disinformation, the lies, the slander. The result of all this is not belief but doubt. People don't believe in anything, so everything is doubted. Like the MRSA vaccine is doubted. It's not that it's regarded as wrong or harmful. People just don't know anymore. In other words, what we're speaking about ultimately is the propagation of alternative truths, or even that lies are a deeper form of truth. When, for example, Dr. Goebbels, who understood lies very, very well, said that the Nazis had sunk our great aircraft carrier, HMS Ark Royal, it was a lie, they hadn't. But had the Admiralty been more switched on, they would have recognized it as a declaration of intent. Because when Goebbels said something, even though it wasn't true, it was about to become true. It was about to become true. And sure enough, eventually they sank the Ark Royal. They had to, because it's an alternative truth. It doesn't matter that this moment in history it hasn't been sunk, because it's damn well going to be. So we have entered really a kind of quasi-Goebbels society. This is not the world of Big Brother or Huxley's Brave New World, those two great mid-20th century dystopias. It's another kind of world entirely, one which involves us intimately in the end, our own manipulation. This is the great problem, and this is the great capacity possessed by the internet, that we no longer are the victim of someone else, but the co-producer. We're seduced, and this was true of the Nazis, it's true today. The real metaphor is seduction, not coercion, and that is a truly frightening thing. Where does this take us? Where will this go? I don't know, but the only possible answer has to lie in education. It has to lie in the schools. They have to expose these techniques. We have to retreat back to the old propaganda analysis movement of America in the 1930s, which was founded not only to oppose Hitler and his propaganda, but the domestic propaganda of the brilliant and demented radio priest, Father Charles Coughlin, who wielded immense power and yet who's been totally forgotten in America today. And in addition, it was founded to oppose corporate propaganda, which was invading American schools big time. We need something like that. We need something like that very badly. What we're going to be left with is not so much a nation really of gulled people, of deluded, fanatical people. Rather, we're going to be left with a nation of acutely cynical people who absolutely believe in nothing at all. That is, in many ways, almost as bad as producing a nation of fanatics. So I'll talk to you in a moment. You have a question?
I do, yes.
Go on.
Would you like me to ask?
Yeah.
So, what's your opinion of Project Fear? Is Project Fear propaganda or anti-propaganda?
Well, that's a very good point. Paul is the great expert on fear. Project Fear is a fascinating idea, and if you want, of course, a virtuoso performance of propaganda by both sides, you need to look at the whole story of the referendum, the whole story of the referendum. We have an article on that in this book. It's a highly partisan article. It's written by someone who is very, very committed. But we published it anyway, even though it's a polemic, because we thought it contained some many, many brilliant insights.